The dust from a distant rider could be seen on the horizon as Delilah Montgomery stood on the porch of her homestead, squinting against the setting sun. At 25, she had already endured more heartache than most would in a lifetime, and the approaching stranger was about to change everything she thought she knew about her capacity to love again. The year was 1878, and Dodge City, Kansas, had seen its fair share of trouble. Delilah's ranch sat 20 miles outside of town, nestled between rolling hills and a small creek that provided life to this otherwise unforgiving land. She had inherited it when her husband, Thomas, was killed in a stagecoach robbery nearly 2 years ago. Since then, she had managed to keep the place running with the help of a few loyal ranch hands, but it was getting harder with each passing day. She watched as the rider approached at a steady pace, his silhouette becoming clearer against the amber sky. The man rode tall in his saddle, leading a pack-horse behind him. Delilah reached for the rifle she kept by the door, a habit Thomas had instilled in her. "Madam," the stranger called out as he neared the property line, "permission to approach. I'm looking for work." Delilah raised the rifle, not pointing it directly at him but making it visible. "State your name and business, mister." The man removed his hat, revealing sun-weathered features and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Name's Henry Keegan. I've been working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas for the past 5 years. Heard in town you might be looking for hands." Delilah studied him carefully. He appeared to be in his early 30s, with a frame hardened by years of labor. His clothes were dusty but not ragged, and the way he handled his horse spoke of experience and care. "Who told you that?" she asked, still cautious. "Fellow named Jackson at the general store. Said the Montgomery place was short-handed since." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Since your husband passed." The mention of Thomas made Delilah's chest tighten, but she kept her composure. "I'm only hiring experienced men. What can you do besides drive cattle?" "Madam, I can break horses, mend fences, build structures, and handle myself with both gun and rope." Worked 3 years on a ranch in the Panhandle before the drives. She considered him for a moment. It was true she needed help. The spring roundup was coming and they were at least 2 men short. "You can sleep in the bunkhouse," she finally said. 60 cents a day, meals included. First light to sundown, Sunday's half day for church if you're so inclined. If your work isn't satisfactory after a week, you move on." "Fair enough," Henry Keegan nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "More than fair, Mrs. Montgomery. Thank you for the opportunity." "It's Miss Montgomery now," she corrected him. "Or Delilah if you prefer. No need for formalities when there's work to be done." "Yes, Madam Delilah," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I appreciate the chance." As she showed him to the bunkhouse where the other 3 hands resided, Delilah couldn't help but notice the way his eyes took in every detail of the property, assessing, evaluating. It wasn't the look of someone merely seeking temporary employment. Henry Keegan looked like a man searching for something more permanent. The first week passed quickly. Henry proved to be everything he'd claimed and more. He rose before the others, worked tirelessly throughout the day, and even spent evenings repairing equipment the previous hands had neglected. His presence somehow made the other workers step up their efforts as well, as though unwilling to be outdone by the newcomer. By the end of the second week, Delilah found herself watching him more often than necessary. There was something about the way he moved with such purpose, the quiet confidence in his actions, the respect he showed to both the land and animals. One evening, as the men gathered around the outdoor fire pit after dinner, Delilah approached with a pot of coffee. "You've earned your keep, Mr. Keegan," she said as she poured him a cup. "I'm willing to make your position permanent if you're interested." Henry accepted the cup with a nod. "I'd like that very much. This is good land, well managed despite the challenges." The other hands excused themselves, heading back to the bunkhouse, leaving Delilah and Henry alone by the fire. "May I speak frankly?" Henry asked after a few moments of silence. "I prefer it, actually," Delilah replied. "You've done an admirable job keeping this place running, but you're working yourself to exhaustion. A ranch this size needs a foreman, someone to coordinate the daily operations while you handle the business side." Delilah stiffened. "Are you suggesting I can't manage my own property, Mr. Keegan?" "Not at all," he said quickly. "I'm suggesting you shouldn't have to do it alone. Your husband built something worth preserving here. I'd like to help you preserve it." The mention of Thomas again brought that familiar ache. "You didn't know my husband?" "No, madam, I didn't. But I know good craftsmanship when I see it. Those barn doors, the irrigation system to the north pasture, that's the work of a man who cared about building something that would last." Delilah looked away, fighting the sudden swell of emotion. "He had plans to expand, wanted to build a proper horse breeding program." Henry nodded, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Good quarter horse stock could bring steady income, less dependent on cattle market fluctuations. They talked late into the night about the ranch's potential, about cattle prices and water rights, about the railroad's expansion and what it might mean for their region. By the time Delilah retired to her house, she had offered Henry the position of foreman, and he had accepted. Over the next 3 months, the ranch transformed under their combined efforts. Henry reorganized the cattle operation, implemented a rotation system for the pastures to prevent overgrazing, and began breaking 2 promising young stallions for the foundation of the breeding program Thomas had envisioned. Delilah found herself smiling more often. The weight she'd carried since Thomas's death hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted, becoming somehow more manageable with Henry's steady presence. Then came the night that changed everything between them. A spring storm had rolled in unexpectedly, bringing lightning that struck a tree near the north pasture. The resulting fire threatened both the fence line and the cattle beyond. All hands rushed to battle the blaze, using wet blankets and shovels to create fire breaks in the dry grass. Working side by side through the night, Delilah and Henry managed to contain the fire before it could cause significant damage. Exhausted, soaked from the rain that finally came, they stumbled back toward the main house just before dawn. "You should get some rest," Henry said, his voice hoarse from smoke and exertion. "I'll check on the herd once it's light." "I don't think I could sleep," Delilah admitted. "Too many thoughts racing." Henry nodded in understanding. "Coffee, then? I could use a cup myself." They sat at Delilah's kitchen table, both too tired to maintain their usual professional distance. When Henry excused himself to wash the soot from his face and hands, Delilah found herself staring at the empty doorway, struck by how natural his presence felt in her home. When he returned, she was standing by the stove, lost in thought. "Delilah." His voice was gentle, concerned. "Are you all right?" She turned to face him, suddenly aware of how close he was standing. "I was just thinking about Thomas. He would have known that tree was a risk. He always worried about lightning strikes in that section." Henry didn't respond immediately, simply waiting for her to continue. "Sometimes I feel like I'm failing him," she admitted. "Like I'm not honoring what he built here. From what I can see, you're doing exactly what he would have wanted, keeping this place alive, making it thrive." Henry's eyes held hers. "He'd be proud of you." Something in his words broke through the wall she'd built around her grief. Tears welled up unexpectedly, and Delilah turned away, embarrassed by the display of emotion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be." Henry stepped closer but didn't touch her, Grief isn't something to apologize for. The understanding in his voice only made the tears come faster. Delilah moved to the kitchen table and sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands as quiet sobs shook her shoulders. Henry quietly stoked the kitchen fire, giving her a moment of privacy while ensuring the chill of the early morning wouldn't add to her discomfort. When her crying subsided, he sat in the chair opposite her. She was crying into her hands by the fire. The cowboy said, "You're allowed to still miss him." The simple permission, the acknowledgement that her grief was valid, opened something inside Delilah. She looked up at Henry, her face tear-streaked but no longer ashamed. "Everyone expects me to move on," she said softly. "It's been nearly 2 years. The banker, the townspeople, even Thomas's family, they think I should sell the ranch, remarry, start over." Henry shook his head. "Grief doesn't keep a calendar, Delilah. It takes the time it takes." "How do you know?" she asked. A shadow passed over his face. "I lost my wife and daughter to influenza 6 years ago in Tennessee. That's why I headed west." The revelation stunned Delilah into silence. In all their conversations, he had never mentioned a family. "I'm so sorry," she finally managed. "I had no idea." Henry's smile was sad but genuine. "Most days now, the memories bring more comfort than pain, but there are still moments when it feels like yesterday." Delilah reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The contact was brief but significant, the first time they had touched beyond the accidental brush of hands passing tools or supplies. "Thank you," she said, "for understanding." Something shifted between them that morning, a new layer of trust and understanding that went beyond employer and foreman. As spring blossomed into summer, Delilah found herself seeking Henry's company even when ranch business didn't require it. They began taking supper together in the main house several times a week, discussing books they had read, sharing stories of their lives before loss had reshaped them. The town noticed, of course. Gossip spread quickly in small communities, and Dodge City was no exception. When Delilah rode into town for supplies one Saturday in July, she overheard whispers at the general store. "Living in sin, if you ask me." Thomas Montgomery barely cold in his grave, Delilah straightened her spine and approached the counter where 2 women were speaking to the shopkeeper. "Good afternoon, ladies. I believe you were discussing my personal affairs. Perhaps you'd care to address your concerns to me directly." The women had the decency to look embarrassed, but one, Martha Simmons, wife of the local banker, recovered quickly. "We're merely concerned for your reputation, Delilah dear. A young widow living alone with ranch hands, particularly when one seems to have taken up residence in your home. Mr. Keegan is my foreman, and he resides in the bunkhouse with the other hands." Delilah cut in, her voice firm. "Not that my living arrangements are any concern of yours." "Of course," Martha said with false sweetness. "Though you must admit, the amount of time you spend together has raised eyebrows. Thomas was such a respected member of this community." "We would hate to see his memory tarnished by—" "Do not presume to speak of my husband," Delilah interrupted, her voice low and dangerous. "Thomas valued hard work and integrity above idle gossip. Mr. Keegan possesses both qualities in abundance, which is why he manages my ranch. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to attend to rather than destroying reputations for sport." She completed her purchases in tense silence and loaded her wagon quickly, eager to return to the ranch where she didn't have to justify her choices to anyone. As she climbed onto the wagon seat, a hand appeared at her elbow. "Mrs. Montgomery, a moment." She turned to see Sheriff Wilson standing beside the wagon, his expression concerned. "It's Miss Montgomery now, Sheriff. What can I do for you? Just wanted to check on you. Haven't seen you in town much lately." He glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. Also wanted to warn you, there's been talk of cattle rustling to the south. Braddock's place lost nearly 30 head last week. Delilah frowned. We haven't noticed anything missing, but I'll tell my men to keep watch. Thank you for the warning. The sheriff nodded. This new foreman of yours, Keegan, is it? What do you know about him? Enough to trust him with my livelihood, she replied, her tone cooling. Has there been some complaint about him? No, nothing like that, just doing my due diligence. New faces in these parts often come with histories. Don't we all? Delilah said pointedly. Good day, Sheriff. As she drove the wagon out of town, Delilah couldn't shake a sense of unease. The sheriff's questions about Henry seemed more than casual inquiry. By the time she reached the ranch, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Henry was waiting at the barn, ready to help unload the supplies. One look at her face told him something was wrong. Trouble in town? He asked as he lifted a heavy sack of flour from the wagon. Delilah sighed. Nothing I couldn't handle, just wagging tongues with nothing better to do than speculate about my personal affairs. She hesitated before adding, the sheriff mentioned cattle rustling at the Braddock ranch. He also seemed unusually interested in your background. Henry's hands paused briefly in their work, but his expression remained neutral. Not surprising. A good sheriff keeps tabs on newcomers. Is there something I should know? Delilah asked directly. Something in your past that might concern me. Henry set down the supplies and faced her squarely. Nothing dishonorable. I've never broken the law if that's what you're asking, but I have had disagreements with men in positions of authority. What kind of disagreements? He seemed to weigh his words carefully. After my wife and daughter died, I worked for a man named Willoughby in Tennessee, powerful landowner, friends with the local law. He had a habit of changing the terms of employment after work was completed. When I objected, things got complicated. Complicated how? His son took exception to being denied what he wanted. There was a fight. I left town rather than risk escalation, but rumors follow a man who stands up to wealth and power. Delilah studied his face, looking for any sign of deception. Is that why you came west, running from trouble? I came west because there was nothing left for me in Tennessee, Henry answered honestly. The trouble might have hastened my departure, but it wasn't the cause. She nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. We should increase the night patrols just to be safe. I won't lose any cattle to rustlers. That night, Delilah lay awake longer than usual, considering all that had happened. The town's gossip bothered her less than she'd expected. What truly unsettled her was the realization that her feelings for Henry had grown beyond friendship or professional respect. In the quiet darkness of her bedroom, she could admit to herself what she couldn't yet say aloud. She was falling in love with him. The thought brought both excitement and guilt. Was it a betrayal of Thomas's memory to feel this way about another man? Or was it, as Henry had suggested that morning by the fire, simply part of moving forward while still honoring the past? Before she could resolve these questions, a sound from outside caught her attention: hoofbeats, moving fast. Delilah got up quickly, pulling a robe over her nightgown and grabbing her rifle from beside the bed. By the time she reached the porch, one of the ranch hands, young Billy Wilson, was dismounting from his horse, breathless. Miss Montgomery, rustlers at the north pasture. Mr. Keegan sent me to warn you while he and the others try to head them off. Delilah's blood ran cold. How many? At least 6 men. They've already gathered about 20 head and are driving them toward the boundary. Saddle my horse, she ordered, turning back to the house. I'll be ready in 2 minutes. But miss, do it, Billy. This is my ranch and I'll defend it. True to her word, Delilah emerged moments later, dressed in riding clothes, her rifle in a saddle scabbard and a revolver at her hip. Thomas had taught her to shoot years ago, and she had maintained the skill after his death, knowing that a woman alone needed to be able to defend herself. They rode hard toward the north pasture, guided by the distant sounds of cattle and men. As they crested a ridge, Delilah could see the scene unfolding in the valley below, a small herd of cattle being driven by masked riders, with Henry and the other two hands attempting to flank them while outnumbered. "Billy, ride to town for the sheriff," Delilah instructed. "Tell him what's happening." "What about you?" "I'm going to help my men." Without waiting for his response, Delilah urged her horse down the slope, taking a position that would allow her to intercept the rustlers if they changed course. The night was clear, with a three-quarter moon providing enough light to see the movement of men and beasts. As she neared the action, a shot rang out. One of the rustlers had fired at Henry, who dodged just in time, the bullet kicking up dirt where he had stood a moment before. Delilah raised her rifle, aimed carefully at the sky above the cattle, and fired a warning shot. "That's far enough," she shouted. "The next shot won't be a warning." The rustlers hesitated, clearly not expecting additional opposition. Henry used the distraction to close the distance, his own rifle now trained on the nearest thief. "Drop your weapons and back away from my cattle," Henry called out, his voice steady and authoritative. For a moment, it seemed the rustlers might comply. Then one of them, a large man on a dark horse, shouted an order, and three of them broke away, charging directly toward Delilah. Time seemed to slow. Delilah took aim at the lead rider's horse, not wanting to kill the animal but seeing no alternative. Before she could fire, a shot from Henry's direction dropped the rider from his saddle. The other two veered off, now caught in a crossfire between Delilah and the ranch hands. The remaining rustlers, seeing their plan disintegrating, abandoned the cattle and fled, disappearing into the darkness beyond the property line. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 minutes, but to Delilah, it felt like hours. She rode to where Henry was securing the fallen rustler, who was alive but wounded in the shoulder. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice betraying more emotion than she'd intended. Henry shook his head. "We're all fine. Cooper took a graze on his arm, but nothing serious." He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of admiration and concern. "You shouldn't have come out here. It was dangerous." "It's my ranch," she replied simply, dismounting to help him. "I won't hide in the house while others fight my battles." The wounded rustler groaned, drawing their attention. Henry had bound his wound and tied his hands, but the man was conscious and glaring at them with undisguised hatred. "You'll hang for this," he snarled at Henry. "You think you can just—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes widening as he got a clearer look at Henry's face in the moonlight. "Keegan, Henry Keegan." Henry stiffened almost imperceptibly. "You have me at a disadvantage." The man laughed, a harsh sound that ended in a wince of pain. "Don't recognize me. I'm hurt. Though I suppose the last time you saw me, I was giving orders to the sheriff to arrest you for assault and theft." Delilah looked between the two men. "Henry." "Edward Willoughby," Henry said quietly. "A long way from Tennessee." "The world's smaller than it seems, Keegan. Father will be interested to know where you've landed, and with such a pretty employer, too." Henry's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the sound of approaching riders announced the arrival of Sheriff Wilson and several deputies, led by young Billy. The next few hours were a blur of statements and questions. The rustlers who escaped weren't immediately captured, but the sheriff recognized the wounded man as part of a gang that had been operating in the territory for several months. What remained unclear was why Edward Willoughby, son of a wealthy Tennessee landowner, was involved with cattle rustlers in Kansas. By the time everything was sorted out and the sheriff had departed with his prisoner, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. Delilah and Henry stood on the porch of the main house, both exhausted but too unsettled for sleep. "You should have told me about Willoughby," Delilah said finally. "That he had accused you of crimes." "The accusations were false," Henry replied, his voice weary. "He claimed I stole money and attacked him without provocation. The truth was that he refused to pay wages owed to me and several other men. When I confronted him, he tried to have me beaten by his foreman. I defended myself. And now he's here in Kansas, apparently running with rustlers." Henry ran a hand through his hair. "It makes no sense. The Willoughbys own half the county back in Tennessee. Edward never needed to steal. He was born with everything handed to him." "Except perhaps his father's approval," Delilah suggested. "Some men spend their lives trying to prove themselves, even when they already have every advantage." They fell into silence, watching as the ranch came to life around them, the day's work beginning despite the night's disruption. "Will you stay?" Delilah asked suddenly. "Now that Willoughby knows you're here, there could be more trouble." Henry turned to look at her directly. "Do you want me to stay?" The question hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Delilah knew her answer would define not just their professional relationship but potentially much more. "Yes," she said softly. "I want you to stay." Something in his expression shifted, a guardedness falling away to reveal a vulnerability she had rarely glimpsed. "Then I'll stay. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." The days following the rustling attempt brought changes to the ranch. Henry implemented increased security measures, including regular night patrols and a system of signals between the distant pastures and the main house. Delilah made a trip to town to speak with the sheriff, learning that Edward Willoughby was being held pending trial, but had already sent telegrams east presumably to his father. "You should know," Sheriff Wilson told her, "that Willoughby claims Keegan robbed him of $5,000 and nearly killed him in the process. Says his father will be sending documentation of the charges." Delilah maintained her composure. "And you believe these accusations?" The sheriff shrugged. "Not my place to believe or disbelieve until I see evidence. But I will say this: a man who runs with rustlers doesn't have much credibility in my book." When she shared this information with Henry that evening, he seemed resigned rather than surprised. "Augustus Willoughby has friends in high places," he explained as they sat on the porch after supper. "Judges, politicians, newspaper editors. He can make accusations seem like facts through sheer force of influence." "But surely the truth must count for something," Delilah protested. Henry's smile was sad. "In my experience, the truth often matters less than who's telling it and how many people are willing to listen." He hesitated before continuing. "Delilah, I should leave. My presence here puts you and the ranch at risk. If Augustus Willoughby sends men, and they won't care who gets hurt in the process of finding me." "I'm not afraid," she insisted. "You should be. These aren't men who respect boundaries or innocent bystanders." Delilah stood up, her frustration evident in the rapid pace of her movements. "So your solution is to run, again? To let them drive you away from another home, another life you've built? It's not about running, it's about protecting what matters." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with emotion. "And what matters to you, Henry, this ranch? The work we've done together? Or is it all just temporary, another place to stay until trouble finds you again?" The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Henry rose slowly from his chair, crossing the porch until he stood before her. "You matter," he said simply. "More than I expected. More than I had any right to hope for after losing Emma and little Sarah." The admission hung in the air between them, changing everything. "Then stay," Delilah whispered. "Stay and fight. Not alone this time." Henry reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished. When she didn't move, his hand came to rest gently against her cheek. "Are you certain? Once Willoughby sets his sights on someone, he doesn't relent easily." "Neither do I," Delilah replied, covering his hand with her own. "This is my home, my land. I won't be intimidated away from it, or from someone I care about." The kiss that followed was tentative at first, both of them carrying the weight of past losses, both afraid of what new pain might lie ahead. But as Delilah leaned into him, her hands coming to rest on his chest, the hesitation gave way to a certainty that had been building between them for months. When they finally separated, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have much to offer beyond my word and my work," he said quietly. "Those are the things that matter most," she assured him. "The rest is just details." The next 2 weeks passed in a strange mixture of tension and joy. Delilah and Henry continued their work on the ranch, but their relationship had shifted into something deeper, more intimate. They shared meals, conversations that stretched late into the evening, and increasingly, tender moments away from the curious eyes of the ranch hands. Each day without word from Tennessee allowed them to hope that perhaps Edward Willoughby's accusations had fallen on deaf ears. Perhaps the distance and his current criminal charges had undermined whatever influence the family name might carry. Then came the telegram from the sheriff. Willoughby Sr. arriving Dodge City, stop bringing witnesses and documentation, stop advise caution, stop. Henry read the message twice before handing it back to Delilah. "I still think you should let me leave, at least until this is resolved." "And I still think that's exactly what they want," she countered. "To isolate you, to make you seem guilty by running. We'll face this together as we agreed." The following day they rode into town together. The plan was simple: meet with the sheriff, understand exactly what charges were being pursued, and engage the services of a lawyer if necessary. But as they approached the main street, Delilah sensed immediately that something was wrong. Too many people were gathered outside the sheriff's office. A well-dressed older man stood on the boardwalk, addressing the crowd with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding attention. "Reward for information leading to the recovery of my property and the apprehension of the thief," he was saying as Delilah and Henry rode within earshot. $500, payable immediately." "That's Augustus Willoughby," Henry said quietly, "and he hasn't wasted any time." They dismounted at the livery stable, deciding to approach on foot rather than draw immediate attention. As they walked toward the gathering, Delilah could feel the tension in Henry's body beside her, though his face remained composed. "Father!" Edward Willoughby's voice rang out from inside the sheriff's office. He appeared in the doorway, his arm in a sling, flanked by Sheriff Wilson. "That's him." "That's Keegan." All eyes turned toward them. Augustus Willoughby, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and cold eyes, studied Henry with disdain. "Henry Keegan," he announced loudly, "wanted for theft and attempted murder in the state of Tennessee. I've brought sworn statements from 5 witnesses who saw you fleeing with my money after attacking my son." Sheriff Wilson stepped forward, his expression troubled. "Mr. Keegan, I'm afraid I need to take you into custody pending further investigation of these charges." "On what authority?" Delilah demanded, stepping between Henry and the sheriff. "You can't arrest a man based solely on accusations from another jurisdiction." "Madam, I have documentation of outstanding charges and an official request from the Tennessee authorities." The sheriff looked genuinely regretful. "I don't have a choice in the matter." Henry placed a gentle hand on Delilah's shoulder. "It's all right. We knew this might happen." To the sheriff, he said, I'll come peacefully, but I want it on record that I deny all charges and will be seeking legal representation." As the sheriff moved to take Henry into custody, Augustus Willoughby approached Delilah, his voice pitched low so only she could hear. "Miss Montgomery, I presume? A word of advice from someone who understands how these matters work. Distance yourself from Keegan immediately. His kind brings nothing but trouble to respectable people." Delilah met his gaze without flinching. "Mr. Willoughby, a word of advice from someone who understands the difference between truth and manipulation. Your intimidation may work on those who fear your money and influence, but I am not among them." The older man's expression hardened. "You don't know what you're involving yourself in, young woman." "I know exactly what I'm involving myself in: justice for a good man against false accusations." "Good day, Mr. Willoughby." She turned away from him and approached the sheriff. "I want to speak with Mr. Keegan before you lock him up." Sheriff Wilson hesitated but nodded. 5 minutes. In the relative privacy of the sheriff's office, Delilah took Henry's hands in hers. "I'll find a lawyer, the best one available." "Willoughby will have already spoken to every lawyer in town," Henry warned. "Then I'll go to Wichita or even Topeka if necessary. This isn't Tennessee, Henry. His influence doesn't reach as far here." Henry's expression was pained. "Delilah, listen to me. Augustus Willoughby doesn't fight fair. He'll come after you after the ranch. He'll find ways to pressure the bank, the suppliers you depend on. You need to protect yourself." "By abandoning you?" she asked incredulously. "Is that what you think of me?" "No," he said quickly. "Never that, but I can't bear the thought of you suffering because of my troubles." Delilah squeezed his hands tightly. "These are our troubles now. I meant what I said about facing them together." Before he could respond, the sheriff returned. "Time's up." "I'm sorry, Miss Montgomery, but I need to complete the processing." As Henry was led away to the cells in the back, Delilah straightened her shoulders and walked out into the street, ignoring the curious stares of the townspeople. She had work to do. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. True to Henry's prediction, every lawyer in Dodge City had suddenly become unavailable or claimed conflicts of interest. Delilah made the journey to Wichita, returning with James Harrington, a young but determined attorney who had made a name for himself defending ranchers against railroad interests. Meanwhile, Augustus Willoughby had established himself at the town's best hotel and begun a campaign to sway local opinion. He made generous donations to the church and school, hosted dinners for influential citizens, and spoke repeatedly about his son's harrowing experience at the hands of that dangerous criminal Keegan. When Delilah visited Henry in his cell, she found him worried but resolute. "Harrington is confident," she told him, passing a basket of food through the bars. "He says the evidence they've brought is circumstantial at best, and Edward's involvement with the rustlers severely undermines his credibility." Henry accepted the basket gratefully. "What about the witnesses?" 3 ranch hands and 2 townspeople from Tennessee, all clearly in Willoughby's pocket. Harrington is preparing to cross-examine them extensively. A preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. As Delilah left the jail, she was surprised to find Martha Simmons waiting outside. "Mrs. Simmons," she acknowledged coolly, "if you're here to gloat, I'm really not in the mood." The banker's wife had the grace to look embarrassed. "Actually, I wanted to speak with you privately. It's important." Curiosity overcame Delilah's initial impulse to walk away. "Very well. Shall we go to the cafe?" "No," Martha said quickly. "Somewhere less public if you don't mind. Perhaps we could walk toward the church. It's usually quiet this time of day." Once they were alone in the church garden, Martha spoke in hushed tones. "My husband attended dinner at the hotel last night. Mr. Willoughby was quite open about his intentions after several drinks. He plans to ruin you financially if you continue supporting Keegan. Delilah's stomach tightened, but her voice remained steady. I'm not surprised. Men like Willoughby use money as a weapon. You don't understand. He's already purchased the note on your ranch from the bank in Wichita. Jacob, my husband, tried to intervene, but the sale was completed before he even knew about it. The news hit Delilah like a physical blow. Thomas had taken a substantial loan to expand the ranch just before his death. She had been making regular payments, but the bulk of the debt remained. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked Martha, suspicious of the sudden concern. "Because it's wrong," the older woman replied simply. "Jacob and I may not always agree with your choices, Delilah, but we've known you since you were a girl. Your father was a good man, and so was Thomas. What Willoughby is doing using his wealth to crush anyone who opposes him, it isn't right." Delilah studied Martha's face, seeing sincerity in her expression. "Thank you for the warning, but it doesn't change anything. I won't abandon Henry to save my ranch," Martha sighed. "I thought you might say that." Jacob suggested that if you were amenable, he could approach some of the local ranchers about forming a consortium to purchase the note from Willoughby. "It wouldn't be easy to arrange, but that's very kind," Delilah interrupted, genuinely touched by the offer. "But I can't ask others to risk Willoughby's wrath on my behalf. There must be another way." As she walked back to the hotel where she was staying, Delilah's mind raced through possibilities. If Willoughby now held the note on her ranch, he could call in the loan at any time, demanding immediate payment in full. Without significant cash reserves, she would lose everything: the land, the cattle, the home she had shared with Thomas and now hoped to share with Henry. That evening, as she sat alone in her hotel room, a knock came at the door. Cautious after the day's revelations, she approached quietly. "Who is it?" "Edward Willoughby. I need to speak with you." Delilah considered ignoring him, but realized this might be an opportunity to understand what they were facing. She opened the door partially, keeping the chain engaged. "What do you want?" Edward looked sober and serious, quite different from the sneering prisoner of a few weeks earlier. "5 minutes of your time, alone." "I have no interest in anything you have to say," he sighed. "Miss Montgomery, I'm trying to help you, and Keegan, though he probably doesn't deserve it." Against her better judgment, Delilah released the chain and allowed him to enter, keeping the door open and staying near it. "Say what you came to say." Edward remained standing, his injured arm still in its sling. "My father is obsessed with ruining Keegan. It goes beyond what happened in Tennessee. It's personal in a way I never understood until recently." "What do you mean?" "Keegan's wife, Emma, before she married him, she was engaged to my father." The revelation was so unexpected that Delilah could only stare at him in disbelief. "It's true," Edward continued. "She broke off the engagement to marry Keegan, a man with no fortune or standing. Father never forgave either of them. When they died, Emma and their daughter, I thought his vendetta would end. But when Keegan confronted him about the unpaid wages, it reignited everything." "Why are you telling me this?" Edward ran his good hand through his hair, a gesture remarkably similar to Henry's. "Because I'm tired of being part of my father's vendettas. The rustling, the false charges, I went along with it all because I've spent my entire life trying to earn his approval. But seeing how far he's willing to go, buying your ranch note just to destroy you both." He shook his head. "There has to be a line somewhere." Delilah studied him carefully, looking for any sign of deception. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'll testify at the hearing. Tell the truth about what happened in Tennessee and about the rustling. It won't stop my father entirely. He still holds your note, but it will at least clear Keegan's name. It seemed too convenient, too easy." Why should I believe you? Edward smiled grimly. You shouldn't. I wouldn't in your position, but ask yourself this. What do I gain by lying to you now? My father already knows I've become a liability to him. After the hearing, I'll be disowned and cut off completely. My reputation here is already destroyed by the rustling charges. He moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. The hearing is at 9 tomorrow. I'll be there if you want my testimony. If not, I understand. With that, he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Delilah spent a sleepless night weighing Edward's offer against the possibility that it was another Willoughby trap. By morning, she had made her decision. The courthouse was packed when she arrived with James Harrington. Augustus Willoughby sat in the front row, surrounded by his witnesses and 2 lawyers from St. Louis. Henry was brought in from the jail, his face brightening momentarily when he saw Delilah. The judge, an older man named Preston who had been riding circuit in Kansas for over 20 years, called the hearing to order. This is a preliminary proceeding to determine if there is sufficient evidence to hold Mr. Henry Keegan for extradition to Tennessee on charges of theft and attempted murder. Mr. Willoughby, as the complainant, your counsel may present first. The next hour was difficult to endure. Willoughby's lawyers painted Henry as a violent drifter who had taken advantage of a grieving widow's vulnerability to rob and nearly kill the innocent Edward Willoughby. The witnesses testified with rehearsed precision about seeing Henry flee with a strongbox and Edward bleeding on the ground. When it was Harrington's turn, he focused on discrediting the witnesses, revealing that all 5 were financially dependent on Willoughby in various ways. He then called Delilah to testify about Henry's character and work ethic during his time at the ranch. And did Mr. Keegan ever display violent tendencies during his employment? Harrington asked. Only when defending the ranch against rustlers, Delilah replied. He is a man who uses force only when necessary and always with restraint. As she stepped down from the witness stand, the courthouse door opened. Edward Willoughby entered, walking slowly to the front of the room. Your Honor, he said, his voice clear in the sudden silence, I request permission to testify in this matter. Augustus Willoughby rose to his feet. Edward. What are you doing? The judge gavelled for order. Mr. Willoughby the younger, are you offering testimony for the prosecution or the defense? For the truth, Your Honor, Edward replied, which in this case supports the defense. What followed was a detailed account of how Augustus had refused to pay wages to Henry and other workers, how Henry had indeed confronted him, but had not stolen any money, and how Edward's injuries had come not from Henry, but from a fall from his horse while drunk, and the rustling operation. The judge prompted. Edward's face flushed with shame. My idea entirely. Keegan had nothing to do with it. I thought if I could cause enough trouble for the Montgomery ranch, Keegan would be blamed and forced to leave. I didn't anticipate being recognized and shot in the process. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and exclamations. Augustus Willoughby's face had turned a dangerous shade of purple as he stared at his son with undisguised hatred. Order, the judge banged his gavel repeatedly. I will have order. When the room quieted, Judge Preston addressed Henry directly. Mr. Keegan, based on the testimony presented, I find insufficient evidence to hold you for extradition. The charges are dismissed, and you are free to go. The relief that flooded through Delilah was overwhelming. She moved quickly to Henry's side as the bailiff removed his restraints. It's over, she whispered, taking his hand. Not quite, he replied, nodding toward Augustus Willoughby, who was now engaged in a heated conversation with his lawyers. He still holds the note on your ranch. This was just the opening battle. As if hearing his name, Willoughby turned toward them. Enjoy your temporary victory, Keegan, By this time next week, you and your woman will have nothing. I'll see to that personally." Before either could respond, Edward stepped between them and his father. "No, you won't," Augustus sneered. "You've done enough damage today, boy. Get out of my sight before I have you arrested for the rustling you so proudly confessed to." "I've already arranged to turn myself in to Sheriff Wilson after this hearing," Edward replied calmly. "But before I do, you should know that I visited the telegraph office this morning. I sent messages to the Nashville Sentinel, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and the Kansas City Star, detailing your fraudulent business practices, including evidence from your private papers that I've been collecting for years." The older Willoughby's face drained of color. "You're bluffing." "I also sent copies of your personal correspondence with Judge Carlton regarding the fixed verdicts in your favor. I imagine the Tennessee Bar Association will find those particularly interesting." For the first time since Delilah had encountered him, Augustus Willoughby appeared genuinely shaken. "Why?" he demanded of his son. "Why would you destroy your own family?" Edward's expression was sad but resolute. "Because someone needs to end this cycle of corruption and vengeance. It should have been you, father, but you were too blinded by pride and old grudges." He turned to Delilah and Henry. "I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I can give you this." From his jacket, he withdrew a document and handed it to Delilah. "The deed to your ranch, free and clear. I used my trust fund to purchase and cancel the note this morning. It's the least I can do." Delilah stared at the paper in disbelief. "I don't understand. Why would you do this for us?" "Not for you," Edward said quietly. "For myself, so I can face whatever comes next knowing I finally did something right." With a nod to the sheriff, who was waiting nearby, he allowed himself to be led away. Augustus Willoughby, his power and reputation now in jeopardy, left the courthouse without another word, his lawyers and witnesses trailing behind him. Outside in the bright Kansas sunshine, Henry pulled Delilah close. "I can hardly believe it's over." "It's not over," she corrected him, her eyes shining. "It's just beginning." The ride back to the ranch was filled with plans and possibilities. With the cloud of Willoughby's threats lifted, they could focus on the future, expanding the horse breeding program, improving the irrigation system, perhaps even building a new, larger house. As they approached the ranch, the setting sun bathed the buildings and fields in golden light. Delilah reined in her horse, taking a moment to appreciate the beauty of her home, their home now. "I've been thinking," Henry said, stopping beside her, "about what you said that night by the fire, about still missing Thomas." Delilah turned to him, curious. "What about it?" "I want you to know that I understand. He'll always be part of this place, part of you. I would never want to erase that." She reached across the space between their horses to take his hand. "Thank you for that. For understanding that love doesn't have to be diminished by remembering what came before." Henry's smile was tender. "I was also thinking that perhaps we should wait a proper time before making any announcements to the town. Give the gossips something else to talk about for a while." Delilah laughed, the sound carrying across the open prairie. "Always the proper gentleman, aren't you, Mr. Keegan?" Her expression turned more serious. "But I've had enough of living by other people's expectations. Life is too short and too precious for that." As they continued toward the ranch, the first stars appearing in the darkening eastern sky, Delilah felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since Thomas's death. The grief was still there, a quiet undercurrent beneath her happiness, but it no longer defined her. 2 months later, on a perfect autumn day, Delilah and Henry were married in a simple ceremony on the ranch, surrounded by friends and a few neighbors who had stood by them through the Willoughby ordeal. Martha and Jacob Simmons attended, as did Sheriff Wilson and James Harrington, who had successfully defended Edward Willoughby at his trial, resulting in a reduced sentence for his cooperation in breaking up the rustling ring. As the celebration continued into the evening, Delilah found herself drawn to the very spot where, months earlier, she had broken down in tears while Henry stoked the fire. Now, as she stood watching the dancing flames, it was contentment rather than grief that filled her heart. Henry joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. Happy Mrs. Keegan. The name still sounded new and wonderful to her ears. Very. Though I must admit, I'm a bit concerned about your dancing skills. That display with Martha Simmons was rather alarming. He laughed, the sound warm in the cool evening air. My many talents do not include graceful movement, I'm afraid. You'll have to accept me as I am, clumsy feet and all. I believe I can manage that, she replied, leaning into his embrace. As their guests began to depart, calling out congratulations and well wishes, Delilah and Henry stood arm in arm on the porch of the house that would now truly be theirs together. "What are you thinking?" Henry asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. Delilah smiled up at him. "I was thinking about journeys, how sometimes the most painful ones lead us exactly where we need to be." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "To find each other." "To find each other," she agreed, "and to build something new without forgetting what came before." As darkness settled over the Kansas prairie, the stars emerged in brilliant profusion overhead. Delilah and Henry Keegan stood together, bound not just by the vows they had exchanged that day, but by the shared understanding that life's greatest blessings often come after its deepest sorrows, and that loving again doesn't diminish what was lost, but honors it by continuing to live fully, with an open heart. In the years that followed, the Montgomery Keegan Ranch prospered. They expanded the horse breeding program as planned, with Henry's expertise producing stock sought after throughout the territory. Delilah managed the business affairs with the same determination that had seen her through the darkest days after Thomas's death, though now with the joy of shared purpose rather than solitary obligation. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah Emma, arrived just over a year after their wedding, followed 2 years later by a son they called Thomas Henry. As the children grew, they filled the ranch with laughter and new energy. Occasionally, on quiet evenings, Delilah would sit by the fire and remember the night Henry had found her crying, giving her permission to grieve even as life continued to unfold. It had been the moment that opened the door to healing, to loving again, to the family they now cherished. And sometimes, when the children were asleep and the work of the day was done, Henry would find her there, her face illuminated by the dancing flames, and sit beside her in comfortable silence, his presence a reminder that even in a world of constant change and inevitable loss, some bonds endure, strengthened by shared struggles, deepened by mutual understanding, and sustained by a love that honors the past while embracing the future.